Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? London rain had a way of making the streets look as though they had been painted over in grey watercolours. It blurred the rooftops, ran in rivulets down the iron railings, and filled the gutters until the lamps reflected in broken golden pools. On such an afternoon, in their little flat in Soho, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford found themselves besieged not by criminals or conspiracies, but by boredom. The fire in the grate had burned low, and the kettle had boiled one too many times. Tommy, tall and amiable, sprawled in a chair with the day's newspaper folded limply in his hands. Tuppence, small and sharp-eyed, tapped a pencil against the arm of the sofa, her patience as thin as the coal scuttle. "I suppose," she said at last, "that this is what respectable married couples do on dreary days. Sit about, grow dull, and eventually knit things." Tommy looked up from the paper with mild offence. "You can't knit." "I could learn." "You'd hate it." She sighed. "Exactly. That's why we must do something else. A case, Tommy. Even the faintest whiff of a mystery would be preferable to this." As though summoned by her words, there came a knock at the door, hurried, uncertain, as though the visitor feared both entry and refusal. Tommy raised his brows. "Careful what you wish for," he murmured, rising. Tuppence sat up straight, eyes bright. The knock came again, more desperate. Tommy crossed the room, opened the door, and a young woman nearly stumbled into his arms. She was drenched from head to foot, rain darkening her pale grey coat and clinging to her dark hair. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and her wide eyes darted down the stairwell as though expecting pursuit. Clutched tightly in her hand was a small velvet pouch, worn smooth by anxious fingers. "Please," she whispered, I was told you could help me." Tommy steadied her and guided her inside. "Come in, miss. You're half drowned. Sit by the fire." She obeyed with a trembling gratitude, perching on the edge of the chair Tuppence had hastily cleared. Tuppence herself had already fetched a shawl and was wrapping it around the girl's shoulders with brisk competence. "There," Tuppence said. "You'll do. Now, who are you, and why do you look as though the hounds of hell are on your heels?" The young woman's fingers tightened around the pouch. "My name? No, I mustn't say. Not yet. But I've been followed. Ever since I found this." She held out the pouch with a sudden, almost violent gesture. Tuppence took it delicately, eyes narrowing. "And what is this?" "A locket," the girl said, her voice barely audible above the rain against the window panes. "Silver. Old. It belonged to someone who should have been forgotten, but secrets linger, don't they? They linger in families and houses, they linger in objects." Tommy exchanged a look with his wife. "And why bring it to us?" "Because," the girl said, rising suddenly, "I can trust no one else. I was told you had solved things before, that you know how to see the truth where others cannot. Please, keep it safe, and—" Her words broke off as a shadow moved beyond the lace curtain, a man's outline dark against the rain-glossed street. The girl's face went white. "They've found me," she whispered. "I cannot stay. If I stay, it will be worse for all of us." She pushed the pouch into Tuppence's hands with desperate strength. "There are secrets inside, secrets that must not die. Look within the locket, and you will see. But beware, once you do, they will come for you too." And before either of the Beresfords could stop her, she fled. The door banged shut, her footsteps clattered down the stairwell, and then she was gone, swallowed by the storm. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the steady beat of rain. Then Tuppence moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. The street lamp cast a dim circle of light, and within it she saw the man, tall, hat pulled low, coat collar up against the rain. He stood quite still, watching the building. Then, as though sensing her gaze, he turned and melted into the shadows. "Well," said Tuppence, letting the curtain fall back. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "This is better than knitting." Tommy groaned. We've no idea who she was, what she's running from, or why she thought we were the right address to bolt into, and we may have inherited a pursuer in the bargain. Tuppence, this smacks of danger. Exactly. Tuppence! But she was already at the table, opening the velvet pouch. Inside lay the promised locket, silver, tarnished in places but finely wrought. Its clasp clicked open beneath her fingernail. Within, under a film of glass, rested the photograph of a child, no more than 5 or 6, fair-haired, solemn-eyed. Opposite the photograph, engraved in delicate script, were words in Latin. Memoria tenebrarum lucebit, Tuppence read aloud, brow furrowing. My schoolgirl Latin is a bit rusty, but it's something about memory and light, isn't it? Tommy peered over her shoulder. The memory of darkness shall shine, something of that sort. Very poetic. Very ominous, Tuppence corrected. She traced the lettering with one finger, her expression intent. A photograph of a child, a cryptic inscription, a terrified girl who thinks she's being hunted. Tommy, you must admit it's intriguing. I admit it's trouble. Trouble, she said cheerfully, is merely the beginning of adventure. We can't ignore this. That poor girl was desperate. And if she's mixed up in something criminal, then we shall find out. Besides, she closed the locket with a decisive snap, I never could resist a mystery with jewellery at its heart. Silver lockets, emerald brooches, sapphire rings. Don't you think they carry stories, Tommy? All those years worn against someone's skin, secrets whispered over them. They remember. Tommy gave a long-suffering sigh, folding the newspaper with deliberate precision. Very well, but let's agree on one thing. If mysterious men start following us about, we call the police. Of course, said Tuppence, with a smile that made it abundantly clear she had no intention of doing any such thing. The clock on the mantel chimed 6. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, the wind driving rain against the panes like pebbles. Inside, the little flat felt suddenly smaller, the fire weaker, the shadows deeper. The silver locket glinted in Tuppence's hand, a spark of mystery in the gloom. She slipped it back into the pouch and tied the drawstring tight. Secrets lie within, she murmured, echoing the girl's words. Tommy watched her, uneasy. He had learned, over years of married adventure, that when Tuppence fixed her mind on a puzzle, the world itself seemed to rearrange until the solution emerged. It was admirable. It was also, more often than not, dangerous. Somewhere out there, in the rain-swept streets of London, a frightened girl was running, a shadowy figure was watching, and an enigma lay locked in silver. And in their modest flat in Soho, 2 restless detectives had just accepted the opening move of a mystery that would change far more than an idle evening by the fire. Morning came reluctantly to London, smudging the rooftops with a weak sun that did little to dry the puddles left by last night's storm. In the Beresfords' flat, the silver locket lay on the breakfast table between the teapot and the marmalade, gleaming as though it had gathered secrets during the night. Tuppence had slept poorly, dreams full of rushing footsteps and faceless shadows, yet she woke with determination. While Tommy buttered his toast with the caution of a man approaching a delicate operation, she sat upright in her chair, eyes fixed on the locket. We must find her, she said suddenly. Tommy looked up. The mysterious lady of the rain. She didn't exactly leave a forwarding address. No, but she left us this. Tuppence tapped the locket. And London is not a city where one can vanish entirely. People talk, neighbours, shopkeepers, market vendors, they see and they chatter. We'll start there. Tommy sighed, setting aside his toast. You do realise that following a frightened girl through the city is not in the handbook of respectable married life. Tuppence gave him a quick smile. I've never read such a handbook, and if it exists, I should think it frightfully dull. By mid-morning, they were weaving through the narrow lanes of the market off Oxford Street, where hawkers' cries rose above the clatter of carts and the pungent mingling of fish, spices, and damp wool. Stalls leaned against one another like conspirators, their striped awnings dripping from last night's rain. Tuppence led the way with quick, purposeful steps, her eyes darting from one face to another. She stopped often, lingering at stalls, engaging vendors in bright, careless chatter that always slipped quite naturally toward questions. Had anyone seen a young woman in grey, pale, anxious? It was at a greengrocer's that she first caught a whisper. Two women, shawls pulled tight around their heads, gossiped over carrots. Looked fair wild, she did, asking about families with crests of all things, not the sort of question you expect over turnips. Family crests, Tuppence repeated, turning smoothly as though she had only just overheard. How extraordinary. Did she say why? The women exchanged a suspicious glance, but Tuppence's smile, wide and conspiratorial, won them over. No why, one of them admitted, just kept on about a silver locket with engraving inside. I told her to ask at Jeffrey's, the jeweller, 2 streets over. If anyone knows about such trinkets, it's him. Tuppence thanked them warmly and rejoined Tommy, who had been feigning fascination with a stack of umbrellas. Well, he asked. She was here, Tuppence said, eyes shining, and she was asking about lockets. We're on the right path. Jeffreys's jeweller's shop proved a narrow-fronted affair, its windows crowded with watches, rings, and tarnished trophies. Inside, the air smelled of metal polish and old wood. Behind the counter stood a man as compact as the clocks he sold, small spectacles, small moustache, small voice. Yes? He asked, peering at them as though measuring their worth in carats. Tuppence laid the locket on the counter. I believe you may have seen this before. Jeffreys picked it up with tweezers, turning it under the lamp. His brows rose and he gave a small, whistling breath. Indeed I have. Repaired this clasp myself. 2, perhaps 3 years past. Fine workmanship, silver of good quality. And see here. He turned it, pointing to a faint mark inside the hinge. That is no ordinary pattern. It's part of a crest. A crest? Tommy leaned closer. Precisely. Stylized crane and crown. Belongs to the Cranley family, if I'm not mistaken. Old money, very private, very particular. Tuppence felt a thrill, though she kept her tone casual. And you are certain? As certain as any man who has catalogued more crests than he's had hot dinners. Of course. He hesitated, polishing his spectacles with nervous fingers. It could be imitation. One sees forgeries now and again. Clients who want to pretend their heirlooms are grander than they are. Could be such a case. The doubt was deliberate, Tuppence thought. A jeweller protects himself by never sounding too sure. She thanked him nonetheless, slipping the locket back into its pouch. As they left the shop, the bells over the door tinkling faintly, Tommy bent his head close. So, a family with a crest, wealth, and enough secrecy to attract frightened girls. What do you suppose they're hiding? Something important enough to chase her through the rain, Tuppence replied. They walked on, the market noise fading as they reached quieter streets. Tommy, ever cautious, cast a glance over his shoulder and stiffened. Tuppence, he said quietly, don't look at once, but I believe we've acquired a tail. Her step did not falter. Describe. Tall man, hat pulled low, coat collar turned up. I saw him outside the jeweller's and now again by the baker's. Same build as the one last night. Tuppence's heart quickened, though her voice remained calm. How comforting. It means we're interesting enough to follow. It also means we may be in over our heads. That, she said with a mischievous tilt of her chin, is where we do our best work. Still, she did not ignore the unease. They took a circuitous route back through the market, mingling with crowds, pausing at stalls, allowing the noise to cloak their movements. Tommy confirmed the man was still behind them, never near enough to provoke, but never far enough to dismiss. At last, they ducked into a tea-room, all chintz curtains and steaming kettles. From the safety of the window seat, they watched the street. The man passed slowly, pausing to light a cigarette beneath the awning of a tobacconist. Then he was gone into the drizzle. Tommy exhaled. Well, that settles it. Whatever is in that locket, we're not the only ones interested. Tuppence stirred her tea, thoughtful. The Cranley family, she said. Why would their crest be hidden in a locket carried by a terrified girl? And why should anyone want it back so badly? Perhaps because it isn't a Cranley locket, Tommy suggested. Suppose it's forgery, as the jeweller hinted. Suppose it was made to implicate them, rather than belong to them. Tuppence smiled. Now you're thinking like me. The clatter of cups and low murmur of voices wrapped around them, yet the sense of danger lingered. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. Tuppence leaned back, eyes half closed. There's a story here, Tommy. Families with secrets always have stories. We've only tugged the first thread. And what if pulling it unravels something best left alone? She opened her eyes, bright with determination. Then, my dear, we shall unravel it all the same. The locket lay between them on the table, heavy with its hidden history. Beyond the glass, the market bustled on, indifferent to whispers of lost children, stolen lockets and families who lived in shadows. But the Beresfords knew better. The mystery had already drawn them in, and somewhere in the rain-drenched city, answers were waiting. One did not simply stroll into the company of the Cranleys. They were the kind of family that kept themselves apart, aristocrats whose name appeared only rarely in newspapers, and then only in connection with charitable funds or the opening of a gallery. They were a name to be murmured in drawing rooms, not shouted across taverns. It was Tuppence, naturally, who engineered the invitation. She remembered an old acquaintance, a Mrs. Whitcomb, who had once attended a school near Evelyn, Cranley. A letter written with precisely the right mixture of charm and social boldness brought the reply. Lady Cranley would be pleased to extend an invitation to dine. Tommy was astonished. I must say, Tuppence, you could talk your way into the court of St. James if you chose. Tuppence, smoothing her gloves as they drove out of London in a hired motor, merely smiled. It is all in the tone, my dear. Besides, who could resist a charming young couple eager to make new acquaintances? The Cranleys will not suspect curiosity behind our smiles. The estate rose from the mist like something painted in oils, a wide, sprawling house of grey stone, softened by ivy, with long windows that reflected the fading light. A gravel drive curved beneath ancient oaks, their branches skeletal against the autumn sky. The motor drew to a halt before a flight of steps leading to tall doors of dark oak. Inside, the hall was lofty, lit by a chandelier that glittered like captured frost. The butler, a tall, gaunt man with an air of absolute discretion, took their coats. From the shadows of the gallery above, the eyes of ancestors gazed down, their portraits stern and watchful. Lady Cranley received them in the drawing-room, where firelight flickered over silk-covered chairs and gilded frames. She was a woman of imposing height and presence, her hair streaked with silver, her mouth set in an expression that had long since forgotten how to smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," she said, inclining her head the merest fraction, "welcome to Cranley Court." Her son Harold hovered nearby, a thin young man with restless hands and a habit of avoiding the eye. His suit was immaculate, yet he tugged at the cuffs as though never comfortable in his own skin. At the far end of the room, seated half in shadow, was Evelyn. A young woman with fair hair drawn simply back, she watched with quiet attentiveness, her eyes steady but not unfriendly. "We are delighted to be here," Tuppence said warmly. She let her gaze travel with unstudied admiration around the room. Such a beautiful home. Lady Cranley's expression did not change. It has stood for 3 centuries. Endurance is more important than beauty. Dinner was announced, and they moved into the dining hall. It was a room built for grandeur. Long mahogany table, high-backed chairs, and silver that gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Yet for all the sparkle, there was a hush in the air, as though voices dared not rise above a certain level. The meal began with polite conversation. Lady Cranley spoke of local charities, Harold made faltering attempts to describe improvements in estate management, and Evelyn remained mostly silent, offering a smile when directly addressed. Tommy, genial as always, encouraged Harold with questions about farming methods, while Tuppence allowed her curiosity to circle, lightly at first, then drawing closer to the matter of the locket. She waited until the second course had been served, until the clink of cutlery and the soft tread of footmen provided a background. Then, with an air of idle recollection, she said, "Your crest is quite distinctive, Lady Cranley. We came across it recently in the most curious place." The effect was immediate. Lady Cranley's knife paused above her plate. For a fraction of a second something tightened in her eyes, then the mask returned, smooth and cold. "Indeed?" she said. "And where might that have been?" Tuppence allowed herself a small, apologetic laugh. "On a locket. A silver one. It struck me because the workmanship was so fine, and the engraving quite unmistakable. I thought perhaps it had some connection to your family." Harold shifted in his chair, dropping his fork with a clatter. Evelyn glanced sharply at her mother, her face pale. Lady Cranley set down her knife with deliberate composure. "You are mistaken, Mrs. Beresford. No such trinket belongs to us. We have no use for trinkets." The denial was flat, rehearsed, too absolute. Tuppence noted Evelyn's lips pressed together, as though holding back words. She also saw Harold's hand tremble as he reached for his glass. Tommy intervened smoothly, changing the subject to the age of the house, and conversation limped onward. Yet the air remained taut, each word spoken with careful measure. When the servants withdrew after the main course, Harold, perhaps desperate to fill the silence, began to talk. "We had a maid once," he said suddenly, his voice too loud in the hush. "Years ago. She vanished, ran off without a word. Strange business. Some say she took things with her. Jewellery, perhaps. Who knows what turns the heads of girls like that?" Lady Cranley's gaze cut across the table like a blade. "That is quite enough, Harold." He subsided, colouring, and bent his head over his plate, but the damage was done. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, a vanished servant, whispers of theft, perhaps of scandal. Tuppence stored the remark carefully. Red herrings often disguised themselves as careless comments, but sometimes careless comments revealed more than intended. Evelyn's hand, resting on the table, clenched tightly at the mention of the maid. Coffee was served in the drawing-room. The Cranleys offered polite hospitality, but warmth was absent. The great clock ticked solemnly, and the fire popped as though protesting the silence. Tuppence and Tommy made conversation, but every word seemed to skim over the surface of deeper waters. At last, Lady Cranley rose, signalling the evening's end. "It has been interesting," she said. "One must not let the world grow too small. New acquaintances are refreshing." Her tone suggested refreshment of the most questionable kind. The butler appeared with their coats. Evelyn accompanied them to the door, a candle in her hand. As the wind swept in from the drive, she leaned closer to Tuppence and whispered, so softly that only she could hear, "Beware." Then she was gone, retreating into the shadows of the hall. Outside, the night pressed cold and damp, the gravel crunching underfoot. The motor waited, its lamps cutting pale beams through the mist. As they climbed in, Tommy glanced back at the looming facade. "Well, Tuppence," he said grimly, "what do you make of that?" "That," she replied, fastening her cloak, "was a performance. Lady Cranley's denial was far too smooth. Harold knows more than he dares admit. And Evelyn wants to speak, but fear holds her tongue. And the missing maid? A red herring, perhaps, or perhaps not. In any case, I mean to find out." The motor pulled away, carrying them down the long drive. Behind them, Cranley Court rose dark against the sky, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Tuppence leaned back, the locket heavy in her reticule, and felt the stirrings of excitement. The Cranleys were hiding something, and she intended to uncover it. The fog that hung over London that night seemed heavier than usual, as though it had taken lessons from the secrets at Cranley Court. The motor carried them back from the countryside, headlights cutting two pale tunnels through the mist, the hum of the engine a steady counterpoint to their silence. Tuppence sat very straight, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Tommy kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying Lady Cranley's cold denial and Evelyn's whispered warning. By the time they reached Soho, the lamps had burned low, and the street was all but deserted. The familiar facade of their building greeted them, quiet and ordinary, yet as Tommy fitted the key to the lock, an unease stirred in him. Something about the door felt wrong. He pushed it open. The flat was in darkness. Tommy struck a match, lit the lamp, and froze. Drawers gaped open like mouths mid-scream. Cushions lay on the floor, their stuffing spilling out. Books were strewn from the shelves, their spines cracked. A chair had been overturned, one leg splintered. The cosy little home that had so often been their refuge now looked like a stage set for violence. Tuppence stepped inside, eyes sharp, scanning. Her expression did not betray fear, only calculation. "They've been thorough," she murmured. Tommy moved quickly, checking the rooms, but the intruders were gone. He returned to find Tuppence kneeling by the writing desk, sifting through the scattered papers. "The locket," she said simply. "It's gone." Tommy swore under his breath. "Well, that's that. The blasted thing brought nothing but trouble. Perhaps we're better rid of it." Tuppence shook her head. "No, Tommy. Remember? I copied the inscription." She drew a folded slip of paper from her reticule, the words carefully transcribed in her neat hand. Memoria tenebrarum lucibit. She looked up, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. "We still have the clue." Tommy, exasperated, began writing chairs and stacking books. It could have been worse. At least they didn't wait for us with blackjacks. But this proves what I said. We're in over our heads. Time to ring up Scotland Yard. "And tell them what?" Tuppence asked calmly, rising to her feet. "That a mysterious girl entrusted us with a Cranley locket, which was promptly stolen by unknown men who melt into shadows. They'd laugh, Tommy. Or worse, they'd trot up to Lady Cranley, and she'd dismiss the whole thing as a misunderstanding. We'd look fools, and the truth would be buried deeper than ever." Tommy muttered something unflattering about aristocrats and officialdom, but he could not deny she was right. The Cranleys had the kind of influence that turned police inquiries into polite tea visits. He moved toward the door to check the lock again, and stopped. Something white lay on the floor, half tucked under the mat. He bent, picked it up, and felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. A note, scrawled in rough, hurried hand. "Leave Cranley matters alone or pay dearly." He handed it silently to Tuppence. She read it, then let out a small laugh that was far from mirthful. "Well, that's admirably direct." Tommy gripped her shoulders. "Tuppence, listen to me. This isn't a game. Someone broke into our home, rifled through everything we own, and left us a threat. Next time they might not wait until we're out." She placed her hand over his. "And if we stop now, what becomes of the girl who came to us in desperation? What becomes of Evelyn, trapped in that dreadful house with a mother who rules like an empress of ice? We can't turn back, Tommy. We've been chosen, whether we like it or not." Her voice was soft, but it carried the iron of conviction. Tommy sighed, dropping into a chair with a thump. "Why did I marry a woman with the instincts of a bloodhound?" "Because," Tuppence said, sitting opposite him with a mischievous smile, "you knew life would never be dull." He reached across the table, taking her hand. The warmth of her grip steadied him, though the room still smelled of intrusion, of overturned cushions and broken privacy. They sat for a moment in silence, listening. The noises of Soho drifted faintly through the walls, a carriage rattling over cobbles, a vendor's call in the distance, footsteps echoing down the street. But beneath it all there was something else, an impression, almost a certainty, that they were still being watched. Tommy rose again, crossed to the window, and drew the curtain a fraction. The street lamp glowed in the mist. Across the way, in the shadow of a doorway, a shape lingered. A man, tall, motionless, collar turned up. "Blast it," Tommy muttered. Tuppence joined him, peering through the narrow gap. The figure shifted, just enough to confirm its solidity, then moved away, swallowed by fog. "They're keeping us in sight," she said quietly, "to make sure we take their warning." Tommy let the curtain fall. "I don't like this, Tuppence, not one bit." "Neither do I," she admitted. "But if they wish to frighten us into silence, they'll find us poor candidates. Fear sharpens curiosity, don't you think?" He looked at her in disbelief. "You're extraordinary. Most people would be packing trunks by now." "Most people," she said, gathering the scattered books into a neat pile, "do not stumble into mysteries quite as often as we do. Besides, you may grumble, Tommy, but I know you too. You would be bored stiff without it." He gave a reluctant smile. "You're not wrong, but promise me one thing. If it comes to a point of real danger, you'll let me handle it." "I promise to consider it," she replied sweetly, which he knew meant nothing at all. The lamp sputtered, casting long shadows across the disordered room. The words of the note echoed in Tommy's mind. "Leave Cranley matters alone." But he also saw again the pale, trembling face of the girl who had come to them through the rain, her voice breaking with fear as she pressed the locket into Tuppence's hand. No, they could not leave it alone. Tuppence laid the slip of copied Latin neatly on the table. "The memory of darkness shall shine," she murmured. "Whatever it means, it frightens them enough to ransack our home. That makes it worth pursuing." Tommy rubbed a hand through his hair, already resigned. "Very well, but if one more chair leg is broken, I shall send the bill directly to Lady Cranley." They laughed softly, the sound easing the tension, though the sense of peril remained. Outside, the fog pressed close to the window panes. Somewhere in the darkness, footsteps paused, then moved on. The city breathed around them, vast and unknowable. In their little flat, disorder still scattered across the floor, Tommy and Tuppence sat together, bound not only by marriage but by the unspoken agreement that adventure, dangerous though it might be, was preferable to safety without purpose. And in the corner of the table, the scrap of paper bearing that cryptic Latin phrase glowed faintly in the lamplight, as though even ink and parchment carried secrets waiting to be revealed. The morning after the break-in dawned pale and wan, as if London itself shared in the unease that lingered in the Beresfords' flat. Yet for all the overturned cushions and threatening notes, Tuppence was unshaken. She had already hatched a plan before Tommy had finished his first cup of tea. "We must go back to Cranley Court," she declared. Tommy, still grumbling about the broken chair leg, nearly choked on his toast. "Back? After last night's warning? I was hoping for a quiet day in town, perhaps a cinema." Tuppence shook her head. "The more they try to frighten us, the more certain I am that the locket holds something vital. And Evelyn, she tried to warn us. We must give her another chance to speak." So it was that, under the genial guise of a young couple eager to see the gardens of a grand estate, the Beresfords returned to Cranley Court. A letter, carefully worded by Tuppence and signed with Tommy's more respectable hand, had secured them the invitation. Lady Cranley, perhaps too haughty to suspect ulterior motives, agreed. The day was mild, a thin autumn sun breaking through the clouds. The great house looked less forbidding in daylight, though its stone walls seemed to hold shadows of their own. They were met in the hall by Harold, who greeted them with stiff politeness, his eyes darting nervously toward the staircase, as if expecting his mother at any moment. "My mother has consented to your tour of the grounds," he said. "I am to accompany you. Evelyn may join us later." Tommy clapped him heartily on the shoulder, adopting a tone of hearty camaraderie. "Splendid. I was particularly interested in your farming arrangements last time. Perhaps you can enlighten me further on the management of such extensive lands." Harold blinked, clearly unaccustomed to anyone taking genuine interest in estate accounts. Tuppence, with a secret smile, left Tommy to his distraction and allowed herself to drift a little behind. The gardens were vast, rolling lawns, clipped hedges, and a rose garden that stretched in orderly rows, though many of the blooms were past their prime. Bees hummed sluggishly among the remaining flowers. Statues stood at intervals, their stone faces worn smooth by centuries of rain. As they passed between two yew hedges, a figure slipped into step beside Tuppence. Evelyn, pale in a cream dress, moved with quiet urgency. In her hand was a folded slip of paper. She pressed it into Tuppence's palm, her eyes never leaving Harold and Tommy ahead. "Read this later," she whispered. "Please, it is not safe to speak here." Tuppence closed her fingers over the note. She caught the faint tremor in Evelyn's hand, the tension in her posture. Evelyn quickened her pace and rejoined her brother, leaving Tuppence with the unmistakable sense of a secret shared under the very nose of danger. They continued through the gardens, Harold explaining in anxious detail the cost of rose fertilizer, until Tuppence excused herself to admire the older plantings. She slipped away toward the far corner of the rose garden, where the hedges grew wilder, ivy trailing unchecked. There, half hidden beneath the tangled green, she found something unexpected. A rusted iron frame, its paint long since peeled, held the remnants of an old swing set. The ropes had rotted away, leaving only the metal bars. Beneath it, the ground was uneven, as though once worn by many small feet. Tuppence bent, brushing aside the ivy. Something glinted in the soil. She dug gently with her fingers and drew out a tiny buckle, tarnished with age, but still recognizable as belonging to a child's shoe. For a moment she stared at it, the weight of the discovery pressing on her. It was not unusual for children to lose trinkets in gardens, but in this garden, with its air of suppressed history, every object seemed to carry meaning. She slipped the buckle into her pocket, brushing the dirt from her gloves, and rejoined the others. Tommy, still engaged in Harold's disjointed explanations, looked relieved to see her. Their tour ended in a shaded alcove where tea had been laid. Lady Cranley appeared, serene and commanding, her eyes sharp as hawks. Conversation over tea was stiff. The family seemed determined to show nothing of themselves. Evelyn remained silent, her gaze fixed on her cup. At last, the Beresfords took their leave. The butler escorted them back to the motor. Evelyn did not appear again. It was only once they were safely on the road that Tuppence drew the note from her pocket. She opened it with careful fingers. The handwriting was small, hurried, but legible. "Meet me in the rose garden at dusk tomorrow. I cannot speak freely under mother's eye. There are things you must know." Tuppence folded the note and replaced it in her bag. Her eyes met Tommy's, and she saw both apprehension and excitement reflected there. "Well?" he asked. "She wants to meet us secretly, tomorrow, in the rose garden." Tommy groaned, as if we weren't already deep enough in this. But Tuppence's thoughts were still on the buckle, heavy in her pocket. She drew it out and placed it on his palm. "Found this beneath the swing set," she said quietly. "A child's shoe buckle." Tommy turned it over, his brow furrowing. "Old, but not ancient. From within the last few decades, at least. So what do you suppose?" "I suppose," Tuppence said slowly, "that Evelyn was not the only Cranley child. She once had a younger sister, and that sister is the one who disappeared." Tommy's eyes widened. "And the locket?" "It must have belonged to the lost child. Evelyn's note, her fear, the inscription about memory and light. Tommy, it all points to someone who vanished, someone they are desperate to keep hidden." Tommy whistled softly. "And Lady Cranley?" "We'll never let the truth be told," Tuppence finished. The motor rattled on through the countryside, carrying them back toward London. Yet the mystery no longer seemed confined to dusty lockets and cryptic inscriptions. A human life was at the centre of it, a missing child, a vanished presence that haunted the Cranley family. As the hedgerows blurred past, Tuppence sat in silence, her mind racing with connections. The photograph in the locket, the buckle in her pocket, the whispered note in Evelyn's hand, all were pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve, no matter how many warnings they received. Night was falling by the time they reached Soho once more. Lamps flickered to life along the streets, and the fog began to creep in again. Tommy parked the motor, his expression grim but resolved. "We're in it now, Tuppence. Up to our necks." She smiled faintly, slipping the buckle back into her bag. "That is exactly where we belong." The city swallowed them once more, but the garden's secrets clung to them like the scent of roses lingering on their clothes. And somewhere, behind the stern walls of Cranley Court, Evelyn waited, ready perhaps to unveil truths that even her mother could not forever suppress. The morning after their discovery in the garden dawned crisp and bright, though the sunlight did little to lift the weight pressing on the Beresfords' minds. The note from Evelyn, the buckle buried beneath the ivy, and the whisper of a lost child had all pointed toward one thing: the past. If the present was thick with shadows, then somewhere behind them lay the source of the darkness. It was Tommy, practical as ever, who suggested the archives. If there was a disappearance or a scandal, it must have been noticed. Families like the Cranleys cannot sneeze without finding it mentioned in the society columns. So by mid-morning, they were seated in the hushed gloom of the British Library's newspaper room. Endless shelves groaned beneath bound volumes, the scent of dust and old ink hanging thick in the air. A clerk, with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, fetched the volumes for them, and soon Tommy and Tuppence were hunched at a long oak table, leafing through yellowed pages. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the very air had absorbed centuries of secrets. Dust motes drifted through shafts of light from high windows, and the faint scratching of pencils was the only sound besides the rustle of brittle paper. "Here we are," Tuppence whispered, her finger tracing a column. "Family scandal at Cranley Court, dated nearly 20 years ago." Tommy leaned closer. The headline was small, tucked between notices of a charity fete and a railway accident. The text, however, told a different story. It has come to light that Miss Margaret Sloan, governess to the younger Cranley children, has been dismissed under suspicion of theft. Certain items of jewellery were found missing, though no charges have yet been brought. Lady Cranley has declined to comment, but neighbours report a general atmosphere of unrest at the court. Tommy frowned. Dismissed under suspicion. That's as good as conviction in households like theirs. Poor woman never stood a chance. "Read further," Tuppence urged, turning the page. Her eyes caught another piece, weeks later, more hidden. Mysterious absence at Cranley Court, she read aloud, voice low. It has been noted that Clara Cranley, the youngest daughter of the house, has not been seen in public for some time. When questioned, Lady Cranley stated that the child is ill and will not appear for the season. However, rumours abound, particularly in light of the recent dismissal of Miss Sloan. She sat back, heart quickening. Clara, Evelyn's sister, the missing child. Tommy drummed his fingers on the table. So, the sequence is this. First, the governess accused of theft. Then, almost immediately, the child disappears. Too neat, don't you think? Far too neat, Tuppence agreed. And yet, nothing further. No follow-up, no inquiry, no police involvement. The matter simply vanishes from the papers. They turned more pages, scouring the months that followed. The name Cranley appeared occasionally, attached to garden parties, hunts, charitable bequests, but never again to scandal. Clara Cranley's name faded, as though erased by invisible hands. Tommy sat back at last, rubbing his temples. It's astonishing. If a butcher's boy vanishes, there's an inquiry. But when it's an aristocrat's child, the matter is neatly swept beneath velvet carpets. Or locked behind stone walls, Tuppence murmured. She stared at the clipping, her mind racing. Lady Cranley controls the narrative. She presents an icy facade and the world accepts it. But Evelyn remembers. She must know more than she dares say. Tommy leaned across the table. Suppose Clara died. Suppose she was ill, as Lady Cranley claimed, and the truth was hushed up for fear of gossip. That would explain the silence. Would it? Tuppence countered. Then why dismiss the governess under such convenient suspicion? Why the whispers of theft? No, Tommy, this feels orchestrated, as if Miss Sloan was sacrificed to protect something far worse. Tommy considered. So either the governess was guilty, and Clara's disappearance linked to her in some sinister way, or she was innocent and used as a scapegoat. Tuppence's eyes sparkled with the thrill of the puzzle. Exactly. But which? Did Miss Sloan run off with the child? Did Clara flee on her own? Or was Clara hidden, deliberately, by her own family? The possibilities unfurled like poisonous blooms. They requested another volume, older still, and the clerk brought it with a grunt. Tuppence traced her finger through births and marriages, deaths and scandals, but the Cranley name appeared rarely. It was a family skilled at vanishing into privacy. Yet there was one curious notice. The engagement is announced between Harold Cranley, only son of Lady Cranley, and Miss Agatha Winters, daughter of Sir Reginald Winters. The announcement was dated 5 years after Clara's disappearance. The marriage, Tuppence noted with raised brow, had never taken place. Cold feet, perhaps, Tommy said, or perhaps the Winters did not like what they found beneath the Cranley polish. Or perhaps, Tuppence murmured, rumours still clung too closely. A vanished child is not an attractive backdrop for an heiress. They continued until their eyes blurred from columns of text. Finally, as the library bell tolled the hour, they sat back, surrounded by piles of brittle pages. Tommy broke the silence. All right, what do we know, really? That a governess was dismissed under a cloud, that a child named Clara vanished soon after, that the newspapers hinted at scandal but never followed through, and that Lady Cranley's hand was heavy enough to silence further whispers. And, Tuppence added, tapping the scrap of copied inscription in her notebook, that a silver locket bearing the Cranley crest turns up years later in the hands of a terrified young woman, a locket containing the photograph of a child. Tommy gave a low whistle. If that child was Clara, then someone wants her remembered, not forgotten. Tuppence leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. And someone else wants her erased, so badly they ransacked our flat and left us threats. The truth lies between those forces, and we, my dear, are standing in the middle. The weight of the archive pressed around them. Dust motes swirled like ghosts, and the silence seemed to throb with the voices of the past. At length, Tommy closed the last volume. One more possibility, Tuppence. What if Clara is alive, hidden away, spirited off, perhaps even by Miss Sloan? 20 years is a long time, but she could be out there. Tuppence considered. Evelyn's note had the desperation of someone who believes her sister lives. But if so, Lady Cranley has kept her absence shrouded in secrecy for reasons we cannot yet see. Why conceal her existence unless there was something to hide? They gathered their notes, thanked the clerk, and stepped out into the London afternoon. The city bustled as though nothing had changed, omnibuses clattering, children darting across streets, men in bowler hats carrying briefcases. Yet for the Beresfords the world felt altered. As they walked toward the underground, Tommy glanced at his wife. "Do you think Evelyn will tell us the truth tomorrow evening?" Tuppence tightened her grip on her bag. "She will tell us something. Whether it is the whole truth, that depends on how much she dares defy her mother." "And if she dares not?" Tuppence's eyes glinted. "Then we shall find a way to prize it out. Secrets may slumber in dusty papers, Tommy, but sooner or later they wake." The train rattled them back to Soho, where the memory of the ransacked flat still lingered. Tommy insisted on checking the lock twice before they entered. Inside, the room bore the marks of disorder still, though they had straightened the worst of it. Yet tonight the atmosphere felt different, no longer simply violated, but alive with new purpose. Tuppence spread their findings on the table. The copied inscription, the yellowed notes, the child's buckle. 3 pieces of a story that had yet to be fully told. "Clara Cranley," she said softly, tracing the name in the brittle newsprint. "The child who disappeared, the child who might yet live, the child whose memory, they say, must shine through the darkness." Tommy poured them each a brandy, setting the glasses down with quiet emphasis. "Then tomorrow we hear what Evelyn has to say, and if Lady Cranley is the keeper of this dangerous narrative, perhaps it is time someone tore the veil from her careful lies." The fire crackled in the grate, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the lamps flickered to life, casting dim halos in the mist. And within the little flat, Tommy and Tuppence sat together, their resolve hardening. The past had spoken in whispers of scandal and disappearance. Tomorrow, perhaps, it would speak more plainly. The invitation to return to Cranley Court had not come by letter this time, but by the furtive scrawl of Evelyn Cranley herself, slipped into Tuppence's hand in the rose garden. "Meet me in the library at midnight. There are things you must know." The words had burned in Tuppence's pocket ever since. Now, as the clock on the Beresfords' mantel struck 11, she and Tommy prepared themselves for the night's dangerous errand. Tommy, adjusting his tie with grim determination, muttered, "We've broken into houses before, but generally they belong to foreign spies or black market dealers. This is different, Tuppence. This is aristocracy. You don't simply go prowling about the corridors of Cranley Court at midnight." "Why not?" Tuppence countered, pinning her hat at a daring angle. "Secrets are democratic, my dear. They crop up in every class. And Evelyn has asked for our help. We cannot let her down." By 11:30 they were in the motor once more, the countryside rolling dark and hushed around them. The moon was a pale sliver above the fields, its light silvering the hedgerows. Cranley Court loomed ahead, its tall windows glinting like watchful eyes in the night. The butler received them with stiff surprise, but made no protest when Tuppence, all charm, explained that Lady Cranley had invited them to stay the night after the garden tour. A guest room had been hastily prepared, and by 11:45 the Beresfords were shown upstairs. The chamber was vast, with carved oak furniture and a bed that could have slept a regiment. But there was no time to admire. As soon as the footsteps of the servant retreated, Tuppence was at the door, listening. "Midnight," she whispered. "We mustn't be late." Tommy groaned softly but followed. Together they crept down the great staircase, shadows stretching long under the dim glow of sconces. The house was hushed, the silence broken only by the tick of the long case clock in the hall. The library lay at the far end of a gallery. Tuppence pushed the heavy door, and it swung inward with a soft groan. The room within was a cavern of books, their leather spines glinting in the flicker of a single candle. Evelyn stood by the desk, pale as the wax, her hands twisting nervously. "You came," she breathed, relief flooding her face. "I was afraid. Mother watches so closely." "We're here," Tuppence said gently. She moved closer, the candlelight catching Evelyn's drawn features. "Now tell us, what is it you cannot say in daylight?" Evelyn's eyes darted toward the shelves as though the books themselves might betray her. Then she whispered, "Clara, my sister, she did not die as Mother claims. She was hidden." Tommy exchanged a quick glance with Tuppence. "Hidden? By whom?" "By Mother," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "To protect the family," she said. "To keep scandal from our name. But Clara lived. I heard her. I saw her. And then she was gone, locked away. I do not know where, but I believe she is still here, somewhere in the house." Her hands clutched the edge of the desk, knuckles white. Mother would rather the world believe Clara dead than admit the truth. The library door creaked. Evelyn's face drained of colour. Into the candlelight swept Lady Cranley. She was magnificent and terrible, her silver hair gleaming, her black gown rustling like wings, her eyes cold as steel, fixed first on Evelyn, then on the Beresfords. "What," she said, her voice low and cutting, "is the meaning of this?" Evelyn faltered, the words dying on her lips. "Mother, I was only—" "You were prattling nonsense to strangers." Lady Cranley's gaze did not waver. "Go to your room at once." Evelyn looked at Tuppence, despair in her eyes, then fled past them, the door closing with a sharp click. Lady Cranley advanced slowly. "I do not appreciate clandestine meetings in my house. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, you are guests. Guests do not creep about at night, whispering with impressionable girls." Tuppence, ever quick, summoned her most ingenuous smile. "We are sorry if we overstepped, Lady Cranley. Evelyn seemed upset, and we merely wished to offer comfort." "Evelyn is fanciful," Lady Cranley said coldly. "Her fancies are of no concern to you. I suggest you return to your room, at once." There was no mistaking the dismissal. Tommy, sensing danger and defiance, touched Tuppence's arm. They bowed their heads, murmured apologies, and withdrew. But once the door closed behind them, Tuppence's eyes flashed. "She is terrified," she whispered fiercely. "Why silence Evelyn if there is nothing to hide?" "Because," Tommy muttered, "Lady Cranley doesn't like anyone playing detective in her house, and perhaps because Evelyn has stumbled onto something dangerously close to the truth." They did not return to their chamber. Instead, they prowled the corridors, their footsteps soft on the carpet. The house seemed to hold its breath, each door closed, each portrait watching. It was Tuppence who heard it first, a faint sound, muffled, almost swallowed by the silence. A sob. She froze, tilting her head. "Listen." Again it came, a soft weeping, from somewhere beyond the panelled wall. She followed the sound, heart-pounding, until she reached a heavy door at the end of a passage. The sobbing ceased. The door was locked, but what struck her most was the keyhole. It was ornate, silver, worked into a delicate pattern, a pattern strikingly like the design engraved upon the stolen locket. She bent close, studying it in the dim light. "Tommy," she whispered, "look, the locket and this keyhole. Surely it cannot be coincidence." Tommy stood guard, eyes darting down the corridor. "Coincidence or not, we can't linger. If Lady Cranley finds us here—" "Someone was crying," Tuppence insisted, "behind this door." Before Tommy could answer, footsteps echoed from around the corner. They ducked into the shadows of an alcove just as Harold Cranley appeared, carrying a lantern. He moved quickly, his face pale, eyes wide. He paused near the locked door, glancing about nervously. His hand hovered near the knob, then fell back. He muttered something under his breath, too faint to catch, and turned away. The Beresfords held their breath as he passed, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows. When he was gone, Tommy exhaled. "Well," he said grimly, "that was close." "Too close," Tuppence agreed. She touched the door one last time, the cool silver of the keyhole beneath her fingers. "But Harold knows something. He's afraid." They retreated to their chamber at last, closing the door softly behind them. The fire had burned low, the room dim. Tommy poured a measure of whiskey, handing a glass to Tuppence. "So," he said, voice low, "what do we make of this midnight adventure? Evelyn claims her sister lives. Lady Cranley descends like a hawk to silence her. We hear sobs behind a locked door with a keyhole that matches the locket, and Harold wanders the halls at night like a man pursued by ghosts." Tuppence sipped, her mind racing. "It means," she said, "that Clara Cranley is very likely still alive, hidden, imprisoned, and Lady Cranley will stop at nothing to keep it so." Tommy shook his head. "It sounds incredible. To hide one's own child for 20 years. And yet, Tuppence said softly, we heard her. We saw the door, and Evelyn's terror was real. We are on the edge of the truth, Tommy. We must push further. The clock struck 1. The house settled into silence again, but in that silence lay menace. Somewhere beyond their chamber walls, behind locked doors and ornate keyholes, secrets still breathed. Tuppence set her glass down with determination. Tomorrow we find the key, and with it, the truth. Tommy met her gaze, his own lined with concern. And if the truth is more dangerous than we imagine? Then, she said with the faintest of smiles, we shall face it together, as we always do. The embers glowed faintly in the hearth, throwing uncertain shadows across the walls, and in the vast, sleeping house of Cranley Court, the Beresfords lay awake, knowing that before the end, every shadow would be forced into the light. Morning crept reluctantly into Cranley Court, spilling thin grey light through tall windows veiled with frost. In their guest chamber, Tommy was shaving with the air of a man resigned to trouble, while Tuppence sat cross-legged on the bed, the slip of paper with the Latin inscription balanced on her knee. Memoria tenebrarum lucabit, she murmured. Not a motto, not a sentiment, a code. Tommy dabbed his chin. It sounds suitably mysterious without being useful. A memory of darkness shining? Could mean anything, could mean nothing. Tuppence shook her head. No, I've seen the phrasing before, not in Latin class, but in puzzles. It reads like a cipher. The words themselves may be coordinates, a clue to a place rather than a philosophy. Her eyes drifted to the window. Beyond the misted glass stretched the grounds of Cranley Court, the gardens fading into a small copse of trees, and beyond those trees rose the faint outline of a chapel, its stone bell tower poking into the morning haze. Tuppence, Tommy began, but she was already on her feet. The chapel, she said firmly. Every old family has one, and if Lady Cranley wanted to bury secrets, both literal and figurative, she would do so beneath holy stone. Darkness shining into memory. What is a chapel but a place of remembrance? By late afternoon, with the house hushed for rest and Lady Cranley presumably occupied with her correspondence, the Beresfords slipped out. The autumn air was sharp, and crows wheeled overhead, their cries echoing across the fields. The chapel stood at the edge of the estate, a relic of earlier centuries. Its walls were weather-worn, ivy curling over carved angels whose faces had softened with rain. The heavy door creaked as Tommy pushed it open, releasing a draught of air cool and damp with the scent of stone and old incense. Inside, the chapel was dim, candles guttered in wrought-iron holders, casting flickering light across rows of pews. Dust lay thick upon the hymnals. The stained glass above the altar painted the flagstones in fractured colours, though many panes were cracked or missing. Tuppence moved slowly up the aisle, eyes sharp. If the inscription points here, there must be a mark, a sign. They searched carefully, walls, plaques, and memorial stones. At last, Tuppence paused before a marble slab set into the wall near the altar. It bore the name of a Cranley ancestor long dead, but what caught her attention was the silver inlay around its border, a delicate pattern of vines and leaves, not unlike the engraving on the stolen locket. She pressed her hand against the stone. It shifted faintly. "Tommy," she whispered, "help me." Together, they eased the slab aside, revealing a hollow compartment behind it. Within lay a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. Dust rose as Tuppence lifted them out, her heart quickening. They spread the contents on a pew. At the top lay Clara Cranley's birth certificate, yellowed with age, but undeniable. Beneath it, a letter, its ink faded but legible. "To whom it may concern, I, Margaret Sloan, do solemnly protest my innocence. I was dismissed from Cranley Court under false accusation, though I never stole nor harmed the child in my care. The truth is darker. Lady Cranley, fearing scandal, orchestrated Clara's removal. I beg that one day the truth be known, lest I go to my grave condemned." The signature was firm, Margaret Sloan. Tommy exhaled sharply. Good Lord. So the governess was innocent after all. Lady Cranley framed her. "But why?" Tuppence whispered, reading the letter again. "Why hide Clara at all? What scandal could be so great as to erase a child's existence?" Her mind supplied the chilling possibility before Tommy could speak it. Illegitimacy. A child whose father was not the late Sir Cranley, but another. A child whose presence threatened the family's very claim to its name. Tuppence's eyes burned with indignation. To lock away a child for the sake of pride. What monstrous cruelty! The candles flickered as though in agreement, and then from the shadows of the chapel a sound stirred, the faint scrape of a footstep. Tommy was on his feet in an instant. We're not alone. A figure emerged slowly from the gloom near the side door. The light caught her face, lined and worn, framed by a shawl. Her eyes were bright, almost feverish. "I knew someone would find it," she said hoarsely. Tuppence gasped. "Miss Sloan?" The woman inclined her head. "I am she, or what remains of her. They took my good name, my livelihood, everything, but I could not leave England. I haunted these grounds, waiting, hoping, and now you hold my letter." Her voice trembled between bitterness and relief. Tommy glanced at her sharply. "You've been following us, watching." "Yes," she admitted, "to see whether you sought the truth, or whether you served her." She spat the word. "Lady Cranley. She destroyed me, but worse, she destroyed Clara." "Clara lives?" Tuppence demanded, stepping forward. Miss Sloane's eyes glistened. "She lived, yes, I swear it. Lady Cranley hid her away, claimed her gone. For what reason I can only guess. But I heard whispers among the servants, rumours that Clara's father was not the master, but another. A scandal that would ruin them all. So they buried the child in silence and cast me as the villain." Her hands twisted in her shawl. "I tried to speak, but none would listen. Who believes a dismissed governess against a lady of society? So I waited. I searched for proof, and I followed you, because I knew you were different. You might bring the truth into light." Tuppence's heart pounded. Here, at last, was the missing piece, the voice of the past itself. Yet suspicion lingered. But why appear now? Why not years ago? Miss Sloane's shoulders sagged. "Because fear is a heavy chain, Mrs. Beresford. Fear and shame. I had no proof, only this letter, hidden away. And when the locket resurfaced, I knew time was short. Lady Cranley would see me silenced for good if she knew I lingered still." Tommy studied her keenly. "And how did the locket come to the girl who brought it to us?" Miss Sloane's eyes darkened. "That girl was no stranger. She was kin, an orphan I befriended, one who listened to an old governess's tales. I entrusted her with the locket when men began shadowing me. I told her to seek help if ever danger pressed too close." The pieces locked into place. The frightened visitor in Soho, the shadowy figure that trailed them through London, the chapel, the silver keyhole, all pointed toward this woman, fighting against the power that had crushed her for decades. Tuppence reached out, laying a hand on Miss Sloane's trembling arm. "You have done more than you know. With this letter, with Clara's records, we can force the truth into the open. Lady Cranley cannot hide behind silence forever." Miss Sloane's breath caught, a sob escaping. If only I might see justice before I die. To hear the world say I was not a thief, not a liar. That would be enough." Tommy, though cautious still, softened. "You shall have it. But first we must be careful. Lady Cranley is dangerous. If she learns we've uncovered this, she may strike quickly." A bell tolled faintly from the house, its sound drifting across the grounds. Miss Sloane flinched. "I must go," she whispered. "I dare not linger. But keep what you have found. Guard it well. It is the only weapon against her lies." She turned, melting into the shadows of the side door, and was gone before they could speak again. For a long moment, Tuppence and Tommy stood in the flickering candlelight, staring at the empty doorway. Tommy let out a low whistle. An aging governess in the role of guardian angel. Who would have thought? "Not guardian," Tuppence said softly. "Survivor. She has carried her truth like a burden all these years." They gathered the papers, tucking them safely into Tuppence's bag. As they replaced the marble slab, sealing the compartment once more, Tuppence felt a shiver run through her. The chapel seemed suddenly darker, as though the shadows themselves resented their intrusion. "Come," Tommy urged. "We must leave before someone notices." Outside, the air was cold, the twilight deepening into night. They hurried back toward the house, the bundle of secrets heavy between them. At the edge of the lawn, Tuppence paused, glancing back at the chapel. Its windows glowed faintly with the dying candles, a beacon of memory struggling against darkness. "The memory of darkness shall shine," she whispered. "Not poetry, Tommy, a prophecy, and it has begun." Together they walked on, unaware that from the trees beyond, another shadow watched their retreating figures. The game was far from finished, and the past had not yet surrendered all its secrets. The air outside the chapel had been sharp with cold, but sharper still was the determination that gripped the Beresfords as they hurried back toward the house. Tuppence clutched her bag tightly, the folded letter from Margaret Sloan pressed close against her side like a talisman. Tommy walked beside her, watchful, his jaw set with grim resolve. "Tonight," Tuppence said softly, "we finish this. No more half-truths, no more evasions. If Clara lives, we shall find her." Tommy gave a curt nod. "And if she does, God help Lady Cranley when the truth comes out." They waited until midnight. The house slept in uneasy silence, the corridors deserted, the great clock in the hall chiming the hour with a hollow clang that echoed like a knell. Then, with lanterns concealed beneath their coats, the Beresfords slipped from their chamber and descended the staircase once more. The air in the lower corridors was cold, damp with stone. Tuppence led the way, her memory guiding them to the wing she had explored on their earlier prowl. At the far end of a corridor, behind a heavy door, she had heard those muffled sobs, the cries of someone hidden away. Tonight they would not retreat until they knew what lay beyond. The governess's words rang in her ears. Clara lived. Lady Cranley hid her. You hold the only weapon against her lies. Tommy carried a ring of tools he had procured in London. He bent to the lock, his fingers steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Old mechanism," he murmured, "not built for burglars with patience." The click of tumblers echoed like gunshots in the stillness. At last the bolt slid free, and the heavy door swung inward on complaining hinges. A draught of chill, damp air met them. They raised their lanterns. The staircase wound downward, stone steps slick with age. The smell of earth and mildew rose thick around them. "After you, my dear," Tommy said grimly. They descended into the bowels of Cranley Court. The cellar stretched vast and shadowed, its walls lined with wine racks long emptied. Chains hung from the stone in places, relics of forgotten use. The lanterns threw wavering circles of light that seemed swallowed by the darkness. And then they heard it. A soft sound, fragile as a sigh, the rustle of movement. "Who's there?" Tuppence called gently. The answer came not in words, but in the faintest whimper, the kind that escaped a soul long denied hope. They pressed forward, the sound guiding them, until they reached a small iron-bound door set into the far wall. Rust streaked its hinges. A single chain secured it. Through the gap at the base, a pale hand had slipped, fingers trembling. Tuppence fell to her knees, lantern raised. "Clara?" she whispered. The fingers twitched as though the name were a half-remembered song. Tommy forced the chain aside, his strength fueled by urgency. The lock groaned, then yielded. The door swung open, and the lantern light spilled inside. A woman sat curled upon a cot. She was thin, her hair streaked with grey, though she was barely past her 20s. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at them, as though uncertain whether they were real. Tuppence stepped forward, her throat tight. "Clara Cranley?" The woman flinched at the sound, then nodded, once, slowly. Tuppence reached for her hand, warm despite the chill. "You are safe now. We've come to help you." Behind them, a gasp broke the silence. Evelyn stood in the doorway, a lantern clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Clara!" she cried, rushing forward. She fell to her knees beside her sister, embracing her with desperate tenderness. "I knew it. I knew you lived." Clara clung to her, sobs breaking free after years of silence. Evelyn rocked her, murmuring comfort, her own tears falling unchecked. It was then that another voice split the air, sharp as a whip. "So, you have pried into what is not yours." Lady Cranley stood in the archway of the cellar, tall and imperious, her black gown sweeping the stone floor like a shroud. Her face, pale in the lantern light, was a mask of fury held tight by iron will. Tuppence rose, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You hid her. All these years you kept her locked away." "I protected her," Lady Cranley said coldly, "from a world that would never have accepted her, from scandal that would have ruined us all. Do you think society forgives? Do you think they would not have torn her apart, branded her illegitimate, a stain upon the Cranley name? Better a prison of love than the mockery of the world." Evelyn turned, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling with rage. "Love? You call this love? You stole her life. You stole my sister from me." Clara whimpered, pressing her face to Evelyn's shoulder. Lady Cranley advanced slowly, her eyes fixed now on Tuppence. "And you, meddling woman, you brought this ruin upon us. Give me the locket." Her hand extended, fingers rigid. Tuppence held her ground. "No, this locket carries Clara's memory, and with it the truth. You cannot silence it, as you silenced her." Lady Cranley's composure cracked. For the first time, raw desperation flickered in her eyes. She lunged forward, her hands clutching, trying to seize the bag at Tuppence's side. Tommy intercepted her, stepping between them. "Enough, madam!" But Lady Cranley was strong in her madness. She struck at him, her voice rising in a shrill cry. "You will not destroy us! The Cranleys endure!" The struggle was brief but fierce. At last, with a final wrench, Tommy forced her back. She stumbled against the wall, her breath ragged, her dignity shattered. In the silence that followed, the truth hung heavy. Lady Cranley stood exposed, not as a matriarch of cold strength, but as a woman who had sacrificed her own child on the altar of pride. Evelyn cradled Clara, her eyes burning. "It is over, mother. The world will know. No more lies." Lady Cranley sagged, the fight draining from her. Her shoulders bowed beneath invisible weight. She sank onto a stone bench, her hands covering her face. Tuppence stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Pride can never excuse cruelty. You chained your daughter in darkness, but her memory will shine. That is what your motto meant. That is what you could never destroy." The lanterns flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the damp walls. Chains clinked faintly where they hung, echoing the past years of confinement. Tommy cleared his throat. "We must take her out of here. Evelyn, help your sister. Tuppence, keep hold of the letter and the records. They will be proof enough." Slowly they led Clara from her prison. She clung to Evelyn's arm, unsteady but resolute. Lady Cranley remained behind, a figure of fallen grandeur, the cellar swallowing her silence. As they ascended the stone steps, the air grew lighter, though the weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavy on every heart. When at last they emerged into the night, the stars above seemed painfully bright. Clara lifted her face to them, her lips parting in wonder, as though she had forgotten such light existed. Evelyn held her close, tears glistening anew. "You are free, Clara. Free." Tuppence looked back once toward the house looming dark against the sky. Somewhere within, Lady Cranley still sat, clinging to tatters of her pride. But the truth could no longer be hidden. She took Tommy's hand, her voice steady. "The chains are broken, but the reckoning has only begun." The dawn that crept over Cranley Court was pale and cold, its light revealing not grandeur but decay. The gilded mirrors caught the morning sun, but reflected only dust and shadows. Within the great hall the Beresfords stood with Evelyn and Clara, the younger sister still clinging to her sibling's arm as if fearful she might yet be taken from her. Tommy had sent word in the small hours, and now the crunch of motor-car wheels on the gravel announced the arrival of the law. Inspector Grant entered briskly, a man of middle years with a bulldog jaw and the measured tread of one long accustomed to disorder disguised in respectability. His eyes swept the scene, the pale women, the anxious air, the detectives with weary determination, and narrowed. "I was told," he began gruffly, "of a matter most extraordinary. A missing daughter, a false imprisonment, and a matriarch accused of cruelty beyond measure. You had best hope your evidence is more solid than your story sounds." Tuppence stepped forward, her chin lifted. "It is solid, Inspector. More solid than these walls. We have the locket bearing the Cranley crest. We have Clara's birth record hidden in the chapel. We have a letter from the governess who was cast out, protesting her innocence and naming Lady Cranley as the orchestrator of this deceit. And above all, We have Clara herself." Grant turned his gaze to the fragile figure at Evelyn's side. Clara's eyes, wide and uncomprehending, stared back. She gave the faintest nod, clutching her sister's hand. Grant exhaled slowly. "Very well. Let us see this evidence." They spread the papers on the long dining table, the certificate, the faded letter, the copied inscription from the locket. Grant studied each, his brow furrowed. At last he gave a curt nod. "It is damning indeed, but I must hear from others in this household. Where is Lady Cranley?" "Here," came a voice, sharp as ice. She swept into the hall, clad still in black, her bearing unbroken despite the revelations of the night before. Her eyes blazed with imperious pride, her chin held high. "So," she said, "you bring outsiders into my home, parade my daughter like some spectacle, and dare accuse me before my own servants. Have you no shame, Evelyn?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "No, mother. The shame is yours. You hid Clara away as though she were a crime instead of a child. You told me she was dead, but I knew you lied." Lady Cranley's gaze cut to Clara, and for the first time a flicker of weakness crossed her face, but it was gone in an instant. She straightened, her voice ringing out. "I did what was necessary. You know nothing of the world, Evelyn. You think society kind. You think they would have spared us, spared her. No, they would have whispered, mocked, dragged the Cranley name through mud. My husband was dead, our fortune precarious. The house, the estate, the legacy, all would have crumbled. I protected us." "Protected?" Tommy said sharply. "You call chaining your daughter in a cellar protection? You call condemning an innocent governess protection?" Grant held up a hand, his face stern. "Lady Cranley, you stand accused of unlawful imprisonment, of perverting justice, and of grievous cruelty. You will have opportunity to answer formally. But I warn you, what I see here is not protection, but tyranny." Lady Cranley laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the hollow hall. "You speak of tyranny, Inspector, but you know nothing of sacrifice. I bore the weight alone. I bore it for this house, for our name. Do you think Harold could have managed? The boy is weak. He always was." All eyes turned to Harold, who had lingered at the edge of the room, pale and trembling. His hands clenched, unclenched. At last he spoke, his voice low but clear. "I knew," he said. "Not all, but enough. I heard whispers, saw shadows. I guessed Clara lived. But I was afraid of Mother, afraid of what it would mean. I told myself it was not my concern. But it was. It was my sister." His words fell like stones into the silence. Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger. "And yet you did nothing." Harold bowed his head. "I did nothing." Lady Cranley turned on him, her face twisted. "Coward. Useless as ever." "No, Mother," Harold said softly, his shoulders straightening. "Not useless. No longer. I will not be silent again." The hall seemed to shudder with the force of his declaration. Lady Cranley swayed as though struck, her composure splintering. Tuppence stepped forward, her tone precise. "Inspector, you have heard enough. The evidence is here. The witnesses are here. The truth cannot be buried again." Grant nodded. He gestured to the constables waiting at the door. "Lady Cranley, you will come with us." For a heartbeat she stood immobile, her figure etched against the tall windows like some defiant statue. Then, with sudden ferocity, she lunged toward Tuppence, her hand grasping for the locket where it hung from its chain. "You will not take it," she cried. "It is mine. It is ours." Tuppence recoiled, but Tommy was quicker. He seized Lady Cranley's wrist, forcing her back. The locket swung free, catching the light as though mocking her. Grant's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough! Restrain her!" The constable stepped forward, firm hands closing around her arms. Lady Cranley struggled, her face contorted with rage and grief. "You fools!" she spat. "You think you've won? You think the world will thank you for tearing down a great house? You've destroyed us all. There will be no Cranleys left, only ruin, only shame." Her words echoed, venomous, but her strength ebbed. At last she sagged between the constables, her head bowed. Evelyn gathered Clara close, shielding her. Harold stood silent, his face grey, as though years of cowardice weighed on him at once. The inspector gave a final glance around the room. The gilded frames, the marble floors, the the hollow grandeur of a house that had sacrificed its soul for pride. "Take her," he ordered. The doors closed behind Lady Cranley, and the hall fell into silence. Hours later, with the storm of confrontation past, the Beresfords sat in the drawing-room with Evelyn, Harold and Clara. The fire crackled, but its warmth could not banish the chill of tragedy. Evelyn spoke softly, stroking Clara's hand. "She will never be the same, but at least she is free." "Yes," Tuppence said gently. "Free to heal, free to remember light again." Harold's voice was hoarse. "And what of us? The Cranley name is ruined. The papers will devour us." Tommy looked at him levelly. "Names can be rebuilt, but you must choose whether to build them on truth or on lies. That choice is yours, Harold." The young man said nothing, but his eyes were thoughtful, troubled. From the corner, Evelyn's voice rose, steady now with conviction. "It is not ruin, Harold. It is justice. For Clara, for Miss Sloan, for all the years stolen by pride. We will endure, not as Mother wanted, but as we must." Tuppence reached for Tommy's hand. "The case is over, but the story will linger. It is not victory we feel, but sorrow, for a family destroyed by secrets, for a house that sacrificed love for reputation." Tommy nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "And perhaps, in that sorrow, lies the real lesson." Silence settled over them, heavy but cleansing. The gilded mirrors reflected their figures, smaller, more fragile, but at last truthful. The shattered facade of Cranley Court could no longer conceal its rot. The world would know, and in that knowing, perhaps, lay the beginning of healing. The rain that had seemed so constant throughout their adventure had at last relented. London, as though tired of its own dreariness, unveiled a night of clarity. Streets slick but shining, lamps glowing with unusual brilliance, and stars peering timidly through the thinning veil of cloud. In their little flat in Soho, however, Tommy and Tuppence were not looking outward. Their world, for the moment, was contained within 4 familiar walls, a steady fire, and the comfort of a tea tray. Tuppence, wrapped in her favourite dressing gown, sat with her legs tucked beneath her on the sofa. She poured from the pot with a flourish, handing Tommy a cup as though she were serving in a palace rather than their modest sitting-room. On the low table between them, resting innocuously on its chain, lay the silver locket, the small, glittering object that had set into motion an avalanche of revelations. Tommy accepted his tea with the air of a man who had earned it. "You know," he said after a thoughtful sip, "for all the danger, the sleepless nights, the lurking shadows, I can't help but marvel. A single trinket, no larger than a coin, pulled down an edifice of deceit 20 years in the making. Remarkable, really. A lesson in how fragile grandeur can be." Tuppence stirred her cup, her eyes fixed on the fire. "It's not the grandeur that was fragile, Tommy. It was the people behind it. Pride corrodes from within. The Cranleys built their world on appearances, on whispered lies and polished silver. It gleamed, yes, but inside it was hollow, and in the end it took only one locket, one frightened girl, to reveal the rot." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You make it sound almost poetic." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is. Mystery always begins with shadows and ends with truth, and truth, even painful truth, has a strange beauty." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the faint hum of the city outside. Then Tommy leaned back, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Of course, I did suggest we call Scotland Yard at the beginning. Save us a bit of bother. But no, you were determined to meddle." Tuppence laughed, the sound warm and bright. "If we had left it to the Yard, Clara would still be in that cellar, and Evelyn would still be whispering her fears to empty corridors. No, Tommy, you are brave in your way, but I am stubborn in mine. Between us, we make progress." He set his cup down and regarded her with mock solemnity. "So, you claim the glory?" "I claim the intuition," she corrected, eyes twinkling. "You may have the glory if you like. I'm content with being right." Tommy chuckled, shaking his head. "Between us, we solved it. Though I will admit you had the sharper instinct about Evelyn. I thought her merely timid. You saw her courage waiting to surface, and surface it did, magnificently." Tuppence's expression softened. Yes, poor child, carrying such a burden. Yet she stood up to her mother in the end. And that took more courage than all our creeping through corridors. Clara will heal because Evelyn refused to let her be erased. That's the true victory. Tommy lifted his cup in salute. To Evelyn, then, and to Clara. Tuppence raised hers in return. To sisters reunited, and to a future free of chains. They clinked cups gently, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any toast in the Cranley's glittering dining hall ever had. The fire burned steadily, its warmth seeping into the room, softening the edges of memory. Yet the images lingered, damp stone walls, a silver keyhole, Lady Cranley's imperious figure crumbling beneath the weight of truth. Tuppence's gaze drifted once more to the locket on the table. Funny thing, she mused, how it glitters so innocently, as though butter wouldn't melt in its mouth, and yet it carried within it the photograph of a child, one face that refused to vanish, memory made metal. Tommy leaned forward, turning the locket gently so that the firelight caught its engraving. I suppose that is the lesson, isn't it? Secrets may be buried, but they leave traces. No chain, no cellar, no prideful matriarch can smother them forever. In the end, truth rattles the lock until it breaks. Tuppence gave a small sigh of contentment. How philosophical you've grown. Perhaps I should keep you in mysteries more often. Good Lord, no, Tommy said with mock horror. I should like, just once, a week of peace. No mysterious women at the door, no midnight prowls, no cryptic inscriptions in Latin. And yet, Tuppence teased, you looked rather pleased with yourself when you jimmied that lock in the cellar. Admit it, Tommy, you'd be bored without it. He tried for dignity, but the smile betrayed him. Perhaps a little, but I still maintain that my preference is for straightforward problems. Broken motors, cricket scores, things of that nature. Then you married the wrong woman, Tuppence declared cheerfully, topping up her tea. For mysteries have a way of finding us, whether you like it or not. One can't very well turn away frightened young women bearing lockets in velvet pouches, now can one? Tommy groaned, but the affection in his eyes belied his words. No, and thank heaven for that, I suppose. They drank in silence a moment longer. Then Tuppence, her tone gentler, said, Do you think of Lady Cranley? Of what pride drove her to do? Tommy stared into the fire. Yes, often. She was formidable, no doubt about that. But power without mercy is a curse. She imprisoned her own daughter for a name, mind you, that may not outlast the next generation anyway. Tragedy, that's what it was. Not tragedy alone, Tuppence said softly. There was courage too. Evelyn's courage, Margaret Sloan's resilience, Clara's survival. Out of darkness came light, Tommy, and that gives me hope. He looked at her, his expression softening. You always do find the light, don't you? She shrugged with mock modesty. Someone has to, otherwise you'd be lost in practicalities and pessimism. They both laughed, the sound mingling with the gentle crackle of the fire. Outside, a hansom rattled by, its wheels clattering cheerfully over cobbles. The city was alive, indifferent to mysteries solved or unsolved, yet in their small sitting room a sense of completion settled. At length Tommy rose and placed another log on the fire. Sparks leapt, flames flared, the room brightened, cosy and secure. He sat again beside his wife, stretching out his legs with a sigh. Well, he said, another case closed. What shall we do tomorrow? A matinee? A stroll through Hyde Park? Tuppence smiled slyly. We'll see, but keep your eyes open, Tommy. Mystery has a way of arriving when you least expect it, perhaps even with the Morning Post. He groaned theatrically. Then may the Morning Post be dull for once. She laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. We shall see. The locket glinted softly on the table, catching the firelight one last time. It lay now not as a symbol of secrecy, but of truth restored, of chains broken, of memory set free. And in the quiet of their Soho flat, with tea steaming in their cups and the night clear beyond the windows, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford rested, not in triumph but in the quiet satisfaction of justice done.